Okay, we're going to get started. Hi, my name is Whitney Donhauser, and I'm the Rone Menschel Director here. Thank you for joining us all for State of the Public Art. This event, as I hope you all know, is part of the series that was produced in conjunction with our exhibition Art in the Open, 50 Years of Public Art in New York. So if you haven't had a chance to see the exhibition, we certainly encourage you to do so after the program because the exhibition is open, or to come back on another day to explore it. It will be open until September 23rd because we've extended it. So tonight we are thrilled to welcome leaders from some of the city's most innovative public arts programs and spaces to consider what next for public art in New York City. So we have the Highline, Cecilia, Alemani, Governor's Island, Meredith Johnson, the Laundromat Project, Kemi, Ilesanmi, and our moderator, Emma Enderby of the Shed and the Public Art Fund. I always want to thank our partners, our promotional sponsors for this evening's program. They're listed in your program on your chair, and we're so grateful to have these important partnerships. And thank you again for coming for the final series in East Harlem's open. Oh, I need to encourage you all to come to our final series is East Harlem's Open Air Gallery, which is a public walking tour with East Harlem preservationist Kathleen Benson, who will give a walking tour of our neighborhood to explore the public artworks that have been created here in East Harlem over the last 40 years, both by local and international artists. It will take place on Sunday, April 15th at 2 p.m., and tickets are selling quickly, and we do have limited capacity for that. So if you're interested, you can register online at ny.org/public art. So I'm going to introduce the public speakers now, but this is when I'd love to ask anyone to turn off anything that buzzes or beeps. But we do love it when you use social media. So if you do want to use social media, and you shouldn't be laughing about that, #MCNY Live. So tonight, it's really a great honor for us to have Cecilia Alemani, who is the Donald R. Mullen Jr., Director and Chief Curator of the Highline Art. She's also the Artistic Director of the first edition of Art Basel Cities, Buenos Aires. Then we have Kemi Ilesanmi, who is the Executive Director of the Laundromat Project, which brings socially relevant and socially engaged art programs to laundromats and other everyday community spaces in Bedford-Stuyvesant, Harlem, and Hunts Point, Longwood. We also have Meredith Johnson, who's the Vice President of Arts and Culture for the Trust for Governor's Island, who oversees the selection and implementation of public art on the island. And finally, we have Emma Enderby, who will be the moderator, and she's a curator of the Shed and the adjunct curator of the Public Art Fund, where she curates the group exhibitions Commercial Break and the Language of Things, and organized solo presentations and of David Shringley Memorial and Spencer Fish Last Man Creek. So please join me in welcoming everyone here, and thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Emma Enderby. Thanks for the kind introductions. And as mentioned, we're here today in connection with the exhibition Art in the Open, which is going to be on view after the talk. I encourage you to all see it. It's a great sort of showcase of the history of public art here in New York. And for someone that's not from New York City, I think, I truly believe this city is very unique in its commitment to public art. It's kind of unrivaled, really, by other cities. Of course, you have places like Public Art Fund and Creative Time, who have been, last year was their 40th anniversary, and the Parks Department has been placing public works in their parks all over the city since the late 1960s. So it's great to be joined today by my colleagues Cecilia, Kemi, and Meredith, who are all sort of continuing in their various ways that 40-plus year tradition. And while unique in all of their approaches, I think each of their organizations really champion both the individual artist's voice as well as the communities in which they serve. So the format for this evening is that I've invited each to present on their organization. Before we can look to the future, we have to look to the past and think how each of their organizations came into being. And I've asked them sort of in a very loose way to present on, how their organization came into being, the ways in which they are developing their projects. For example, how do they select their artists? Are they proposal-based, new commissions, mediums, to touch on their audiences, obviously an integral part to presenting public work. Also a few examples of typical work of their organizations. And then I also asked quite a tricky question, their kind of definition or a quote in relation to the way they think about public art. And I sent them mine, which is one of my favorite, the artist Dan Graham once said that I stole from a book called Artificial Hells, written by Claire Bishop. And the quote goes, "All artists are alike. They dream of doing something that's more social, more collaborative, and more real than art." So after their presentations, we'll have a discussion followed by a Q&A, so please do come ready with all your questions. But I invite Cecilia to present on her work with the Highline.
Thank you, Emma, for the introduction, and thank you all for being here. I brought a few slides. I'm going to try not to turn too many times, but the slides that you will see are examples of works that either we have currently on view or we have featured in the past. But I wanted to step back and give you a little history of the art program on the Highline. I'm sure you've all been on the Highline. If you haven't, you should come. It's a very popular destination in New York City. And I have been working there since the end of 2011, so about 7 years, and I'm the curator of the art program, which is called Highline Art. When you walk in the park, you can encounter many different kinds of public art. These are just some of the examples. This is a mural that we have just unveiled by an American artist that lives in Berlin, called Dorothy Iannone. It's a mural that, as you can see, features 3 statues of liberty with a poem that actually runs at the bottom of the actual Statue of Liberty engraved on the piece itself. It's not physically located on the Highline, but this is also a good example of our approach to public art in the park. Of course, we have plenty of sculptures and installations in the actual park, but then we try to expand also on adjacent properties to make sure that we can use the city as our own pedestal and canvas. We have featured a different range of artworks, from large size-specific artworks like this artwork that you see in the slide, which is by an artist called Sheila Hicks, who usually works with textiles and fabrics and has transformed the very last section of the Highline, kind of around Hudson Yards, where the shed is, into this colorful panorama of tubes and pipes that snakes through the landscape. This is actually the largest and probably more complicated work that we've ever shown. It was also my first year. I think I was very ambitious in the beginning. I sort of have to kind of come to terms with the weather issues on the Highline. And this is an artwork by Ella Natsui, who is a wonderful artist originally from Ghana and living in Nigeria. And he's well known for these amazing tapestries that are made of recycled materials like metals or pieces of bottles. And he usually works indoors, but he had recently done a piece in Paris that we saw and we wanted to bring to the Highline. And again, the Highline doesn't really have walls, so we had to kind of improvise and ask a neighbor if we could install this on their property. And this is what you see, kind of on the west side of the Highline. And then we go from very large piece to very small pieces. This is the smallest piece that we've done, and it's by a British artist called Ryan Gander. And it was basically just a bronze cast of his wallet and phone, as though they were abandoned on on a bench. And really a lot of people thought, they call, lost and found, we found like a wallet. So in a way, we try to work with a wide notion of public art. So sometimes when you think of public art, you think of a bronze monument on a plinth or a large kind of static sculpture. Perhaps because of the constriction that we have, because of the park, it's quite narrow, it's very, very popular. We work with artists to come up with sort of creative solutions to their artwork. So what you just saw are what we call Highline commissions, which are long-term, usually sculptural or installation-based artworks. This is a work by Jamaican artist Nari Ward, and everything usually stays on view on the Highland for 12 months. And we do that because we like to see the work change through the seasons. One of the most striking aspect of the Highland Park is its vegetation, which really changes every 3 or 4 weeks with new blooms and new colors. And so therefore also the artworks change. Sometimes you can come and you might not see them because they might be covered by snow. Other times, they might be covered and surrounded by the fall colors. So we really want to embrace this notion of site specificity. We also have another format, which is called Highland Billboard, and it's a series of rotating billboards that we do on a billboard that is adjacent to the park. We haven't done recently commissions on this site because we don't own this site, and so sometimes you have to go and adjust your schedule according to what's happening around your park. But it was a great way of working with artists that don't necessarily make sculptures or objects, but also photographers and painters and more conceptual artists. We also organize many performances. I think in a way performances is also the most exciting part of our job because it really uses and connects with the people of the Highline, and you have a natural audience that come and is always there. And of course, when we do performances, we invite more people to come, but there is something in terms of a challenge for the artists to come up with something that it's not there is a stage and an audience, but it needs to sort of be intertwined with the flux of people and with the Highland itself, because there is no way to create a more traditional separation between the audience and the performances. So these are just examples of previous works that we did. This is Francisca Benitez, who did a sign language performance. David Lamelas, who is an Argentinian artist based in LA, who did this participatory work in which people had to stand on this line and pass the time from one to the other. Kevin Beasley did the sound performance. Alison Knowles prepared a giant salad for the viewers to taste. It was Earth Day. And then we also do we have a video program that plays every day under one of the cover passages of the Highland. It's called 14th Street Passage, and it's a great way to also showcase, again, artists that are not necessarily connected to public art because they work with digital media and video and film, and so it's kind of a nice way of expanding the program to include other medium. And then in terms of like 3 sort of case studies that Emma asked us to put together. I just added a few more slides about this work. This is an installation by Rashid Johnson, who is an artist based here, originally from Chicago. And we invited him to create, I think at that time it was his first public art commission, and he came up with this fantastic piece, which consists of this sort of minimalist grid, almost like a Sol LeWitt open cube that is then occupied by this shea butter looking bust. But I'm showing you this picture because it shows you the passage of time and the season. So the first slide was from April, the second one was probably from June, July. This is the fall, and then this is the winter. And so it's really important for us to to sort of register these changes, and also to invite our viewers to come back on a monthly basis, if we can, to see how every work changes. So it's really done for local people and for New Yorkers who are here, and it's not just about coming to the Highland once and see the season, but it's to come back and appreciate how really the artworks respond to the site and integrate the vegetation in it. The second artwork that I wanted to show you is a project by Olafur Eliasson. He's a very well-known artist from Denmark/Iceland, and he brought to the Highland a very participatory piece, which was called the Collectivity Project, and it consisted of about 2 tons and 2 millions of little Lego bricks, which were arranged on tables, and then everyone could come and play with them. And the goal was to create and to build your imaginary city, or the city you would like to live in. And it was sited in a very interesting spot, which is actually kind of very near where the shed will be at 10th Avenue and 30th Street, which is an area that is very much characterized by a lot of real estate developments. So many new buildings are coming up, and so we thought it could be nice to give the opportunity to our community also to come and kind of create their own ideal city. And it was a very popular piece. We don't really normally do interactive works like this, just because it's, you know, this was up for like about 4 months, and we had about 300,000 people coming, and so it's just in terms of maintenance. and
Did you have to replace the Legos like every day?
We had to wash them. We washed them.
Glamorous
a lot.
Public art.
Yeah. It was a lot of pieces, so even if people stole some, you know, you wouldn't. We still have so many Lego pieces, and every time I open a drawer, there is a Lego piece coming. And then the last piece I wanted to talk about is a work by the American photographer Zoe Leonard, who actually, by the way, has a fantastic survey at the Whitney Museum right now, just next to the High Line. She did this piece in 1992. You can actually see the original work in the museum. It was just a piece of paper that was supposed to be published in a magazine, and we worked with her. It's basically a sort of manifesto of her political credo. It's I don't know if you can read it, but it starts by saying, "I want a dike for president," and then it goes on describing her ideal president. And we installed this. When were the election? Like just like a month before the election, we collaborated with the Standard Hotel where the piece is installed, and we did also a lot of. We basically organized a rally in which other artists like Sharon Hayes and thinkers and poet. Came to speak and to sort of react to this, and it was an amazing experience because there was so much energy in the room. And I'm showing this because it's something that we could do quite quickly, in a way, in response of the election, which is something that is harder to do when you work in a museum or in an institution. You can't put together usually an exhibition in 2 months. And so because we are not a traditional art institution, we were able to do something that responded to our time in a quicker way. Didn't really bring us good luck, but it was a great experience. And I think in terms of slides, I am done. So thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Kemi, Ilesanmi, and very happy to be here. So Emma had charged us to think about a quote, and the one that came to mind today is thinking about public and art broadly. It's by Cornel West, and he said, "Justice is what love looks like in public." So again, thinking of notions of public. So I'll give you a little bit of history of the Laundromat project. Sorry, I think I have this upside down. That's our mission officially. Another way of saying that is that we ignite artists and neighbors as change agents in their own communities, and really are looking for ways to equip and empower and embolden all of us, some of us identifying as artists and some of us not necessarily identifying officially as artists, but all having a creative spirit to do what we need to do to kind of move our communities closer to what we need them to look like. And we have a number of different programs, and historically, we were founded by actually one of your colleagues, Risa Wilson, who started having this idea about how to bring art to people and to communities that looked like hers when she was growing up in a Black neighborhood in Philadelphia, and wanting to find a space like a laundromat that is full of fallow time and also connects different kinds of people in a space that's essentially a de facto community space. So she started having those ideas in 1999, and we were officially incorporated in 2005. So this year will be 13, essentially. Over the course of that time, we have commissioned projects. We work with artists, particularly artists of color, in New York City, in the context of communities of color and people living on modest incomes. So we actually work all across the city, but we anchor ourselves in 3 neighborhoods, which are Harlem, Bed-Stuy, and Hunts Point Longwood, which is in the South Bronx. And very much kind of thinking about notions of accountability and how do we create cycles of reciprocity, connection, conversation, and that kind of back and forth quality you have by showing up in the same places again and again and again, which I would imagine comes up in your work as well. So we focus on those 3 neighborhoods. We actually have an apartment space in the South Bronx that we call the Kelly Street Collaborative. It's on a beautiful street in the Longwood neighborhood that is Kelly Street. About 1,000 people live there. We're right off of a beautiful community garden, and we have transformed this apartment space into a space for public programming around arts, art workshops. We have studio artists in residence every year, and we work with our neighbors to kind of figure out what to do and what kinds of programming, et cetera. I'm gonna tell you about 2 projects today. The first one is Elvira Clayton. But again, to say that over the last 13 years, we have worked with about 150 artists. Some of those are commissioned every year. About 5 artists are commissioned every year to make a project in a community to which they're accountable. Sometimes that's a community of place, like Harlem or Bed-Stuy. Sometimes it's a community of affinity, and sometimes those 2 things come together. Like in Elvira's project, where she's working with, she was really interested in the Senegalese community, immigrant community in Harlem. Those artists, before I go into Elvira specifically, the artists we've worked with over that time, so again, the other part of our programming is that we train artists. We have a professional development training program for artists who are interested in doing this kind of work that is community attuned and socially engaged and responsive, with an ethical compass and with practical tools and resources and a network of people who are interested in doing the same thing. So those 150 artists are multidisciplinary. They are dancers and painters and filmmakers and writers and folks working with herbs and just a whole range. They are multi-ethnic and multiracial. They look very much like New York City. And again, this incredible range of histories and perspectives and that they bring to the table. They're also multi-borough, which can really matter in a city like New York, where we kind of sometimes stick to our boroughs. But having this opportunity to kind of create cross-connection and cross-collaboration is part of what we're really interested in doing. And the through line for all these artists, and they're multi-generational as well. This year we have, we're about to announce our latest class of artists, and they range from early 20s to late 60s. So having all of those kinds of people kind of coming together, and the through line being that they really see the possibility of using their own creative practice to make a real difference in the world, and wanting to find others that want to do that as well, because it actually does take some skills and networks and real attention and intention to do this. So Elvira Clayton, originally from Houston, she did a project in 2015. Our Create Change program is our program where we commission artists as well as train them. And Joko is actually a Wolof word for connections. And she works in a very tactile way. There's actually a sculpture over to the side, that piece that almost looks like a masquerade piece. She looks at West African and Black diaspora traditions of masking and sculpture building, and she takes these mobile sculptures into the world. So this is in front of a laundromat on 116th Street, where the Laundromat Project has partnered with that laundromat many times over the last, I think we first started working with them in 2007, and the owners of that. So thinking about connections, I thought this picture kind of really captured the idea. She is really particularly interested in, making sure this is moving, the Senegalese community. So 116th Street along Harlem is often known as Little Senegal. You can find amazing food there, people selling West African wares, et cetera. It is also a place where she was really interested in how sometimes you see people, and particularly immigrants and people who might be different than folks you're coming into contact with daily in a really deep way, but want to have an excuse or have a reason to kind of connect and find out about one another. So she was interested in the connection between African American community, the African American community of Harlem, and the Senegalese community, and what could be the connections there, and what are the stories that particularly the Senegalese immigrants had to tell about what it means to be in this country now, and to be making a new home, and to have chosen to do so, and to be part of Harlem, this incredibly storied global city. You can go anywhere and people kind of know Harlem, USA, right? But what was this micro story within that larger community story? And she used her sculpture, which you can see here, which she moves around, and you'll see a photo in a minute where you can see her doing that. This is a Bamba Day, which is a Senegalese community celebration that happens every summer. So she actually went to barbershops and hair braiding salons and restaurants and met with folks and asked them to tell their stories. And then she captured that, made this beautiful sculpture, and then there are headphones where you got to actually listen to those stories. And she's attracting you, right? Like this use of spectacle and having something that draws you in and then turns out to be interactive. But the other thing I want to kind of bring up is the idea of different kinds of publics, right? So this is the African American Day Parade, which usually happens in September in Harlem, where she took the same piece and then took it, incorporated herself into the parade, invited people to listen. But in this case, it's diasporic Black Harlem that shows up, and they're listening to a very specific set of stories about their Senegalese neighbors. So, little publics, intimate publics, specific publics are usually what we're working with. A lot of our projects really focus in on, particularly the history of Laundromat projects have really focused on narrative and storytelling. Not on purpose, but that's a through line that's happened, and various immigrant neighborhoods throughout the city. So we've had projects about Chinese garment workers in Sunset Park, and Filipino Americans in Woodside and other parts of the city. We've had projects looking at Latino immigrants, et cetera. So oftentimes, not only, but that is definitely a really strong through line in the project over the years. So I really think about us as working in community as much as we work in public, because sometimes it's actually an intimate space and not a general public space, but inviting different kinds of people in. The other project I want to tell you about is Lisania Cruz's project, which is from last year. And I'll just preview that we'll get to actually work with this project for another year, which we'll be announcing in a week or two. And it's called We the News. And she was really interested in the news and the stories that Black immigrants had to share. So this was 2017, so thinking about a very particular political moment that we stand in even now. And she ended up partnering. Often our artists partner with particular community-based organizations or neighborhood organizations. She partnered with a series of organizations that work with Black diaspora immigrants, but particularly she partnered with the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, which is short form as BAJI. This particular set of stories you're seeing was when she was partnering with Caribbean, which does work in Brooklyn, particularly looking at Brooklyn as a Caribbean neighborhood, and that's how they kind of think about it. She held a series of story circles over the course of last summer. So here's one in the Caribbean, had a pop-up site last summer. And one of the things that came out in these stories was how grateful and happy and interested the people in the stories who came. They might have come from Haiti or Nigeria, or they might have come from New Orleans, because they actually included African Americans as well. But they had these stories that resonated and that they hadn't often had a chance to kind of share and connect across those stories. She has done a number of workshops around collage making, so allowing different ways. So of course, talking is one way, but telling stories visually as well and kind of making these collective collages. She turned those into zines, which in the part 2 of her project, number 1, they're being used by BAJI and other Black immigrant organizations. So she took the stories and made them into these beautiful zines. Lasagna is a graphic designer and jewelry designer and many other kinds of beautiful designer. But she took those stories and has made them into these zines that are going into public spaces as well as advocacy spaces. So again, justice being love in public, thinking about that. This was her gathering stories of migration at the Tompkins Avenue street festival that happens every summer in Bed-Stuy. And then this was a festival that the Laundromat Project has called Field Day, where you can see that zine right in the front, Crossing Borders, where people were reading stories and sharing stories and again, connecting very much in a more public setting, right? Some of the others are more intimate publics, and this was actually anyone could come up and share in the stories. So that's it.
Hi. So when Emma asked us for a quote, I went down a little bit of a sentimental rabbit hole, I'll be honest, and started thinking about the show upstairs and thinking about the sites and the projects that kind of got me to the island that I'm at today. And the quote I brought was, good old Robert Smithson, nature, like a person, is not one-sided. And I decided to use a Smithson quote because it was Smithson that got me to New York. I actually moved to New York to work on this project, the floating island that traveled around Manhattan Island. So starting with islands and ending with islands. And this was a project that was realized posthumously, which is an interesting conundrum in public space of how you posthumously realize a work. But really thinking about nature not as a one-sided thing, or the approach to nature as a one-sided thing. We live in an urban environment. It's a natural environment. Architecture is part of nature. Landscape is part of nature. The good, the bad, the positive. So really, I just wanted to touch base before I get to the island itself on a few projects I've really had the pleasure and privilege to work on that are these multi-sided projects relating to nature. And this was the first project I ever worked on with Creative Time, where I was 9 years before I went to the island. And this is a project just also thinking about media and the types of art that can deal with nature, how you can deal with nature in different ways. This was a project by Stephen Vitiello, which is a 3D sound project in the middle of London, right near Liverpool Street Station, which is probably the most concrete-laden part of the city you can imagine. And so Stephen turned this concrete circle into a grassy area that had a 3D sound piece bringing bird sounds from the Amazon. So as you walked through, birds would fly from one end to the other. And the thing that was interesting about this is this actually attracted birds from all over London to come to it. I couldn't resist throwing in the High Line, one of my favorite public sites. This is Spencer Finch's The River That Flows Both Ways, a project of how you bring nature into a heavily industrial area. This was a project that we worked with Spencer on, where he actually spent the day traveling on the Hudson River, following the tide, not turning the engines on, and taking a photograph of the surface of the water every minute for 700 minutes, turning them into pixels, and then bringing them back into the architecture. So really relating this railway that flows in two directions to this river that is one of the few rivers in the world that flows in two directions. This was a project in Miami Beach, a different environment than New York, but on the beach and wind and salt water. And this was an architectural space that was designed by Fu Wong and Raquel Rodum that was meant to respond to the environment around it, to the wind, to the mist. So the architecture actually shifted as the elements shifted. And within that space, there were 42 projects programmed. Artists responding to that site, responding to this place from cities around the world. This was a dance performance within that space. And so how do you have an artwork that then other artists respond to as well, and what's their take on this natural environment? And this was the last project I worked on before I got to the island, which was about another island in the middle of the Brooklyn Navy Yard, Cobb Dock, and the history of pigeon keeping, and how do you actually work with nature in real nature, birds. 2,000 birds that were part of a series of performances that were really addressing the history of this place and also the living communities around New York that continue to host these animals in their lives, pigeon keepers all around New York. And it's a story of nature and humanity and community. So I was very lucky in 2017 to join the Trust for Governor's Island. And Governor's Island was not new to me. Creative Time had done a large-scale project on Governor's Island in 2009, and it's one of those places that to me has always been awe-inspiring. It's an island in the middle of the harbor. No one lives on it. It's expansive, open space. And Governor's Island, basically from the Revolutionary War until 1966, was a military base. From 1966 to 1996, it was a Coast Guard base, and in 1996, the Coast Guard left. And it was abandoned. And a decade later, the federal government deeded it over to the people of New York. So it became really one of the biggest public spaces for the people of New York, a kind of central park in the middle of the harbor. And as you can see from the aerial view, it exists on a scale that really doesn't exist anywhere else in New York in terms of expansive space. From architecture, we have buildings, lots of historic buildings. We have expansive space. We have the harbor. And we're really at the front door of sea level rise and climate change. And so I thought I'd give you a brief history of how art has engaged in Governor's Island since it opened up as a public space, because it was really artists and art that was part of the forefront of the island's new identity. And in 2004, the Public Art Fund commissioned Lisa Koreski and Andrew Moore to do a photographic project of these spaces on Governor's Island that were there then. Some of them are still there, some of them are gone, and it's really a documentation of a place at a moment in time, which I think, public art by definition is about a moment in time. In 2007, the island began hosting festivals and fairs, and one of the things that the island has done very well since 2007 is to really open up the space for organizations and artists throughout the city to propose projects, to do things, to address audiences in ways that they might not be able to elsewhere in their practice or elsewhere in New York. In 2009, Creative Time came to the island and did a series of site-specific works throughout the architectural spaces and the landscapes. In 2011 was the amazing Mark DeSuvero show on Governor's Island that was presented by Storm King. So this is a moment in time, starting with the Public Art Fund and continuing, that organizations really used the island as a platform for programming at a range of scale. In 2013, the first permanent work was commissioned with Day is Done by Susan Phillips, which is a piece that plays at the close, the hour before the island closes. So you hear taps playing is kind of your call to go to the ferries. And the thing that's amazing, that I find amazing about the island, is this place that has this. When you get off the boat, it's like the curtain opens, and when you get back on the boat at the end of the day, the curtain closes. And so I think Susan's piece very much resonates with this kind of theatrical nature of going to a site. In 2014, Yankee Hangar became part of our collection, and this was part of a group show of Mark Hamforth that was curated by Tom Eccles on the island. In 2015, another group show, Visitors, which had multiple artists, and the group show, it's interesting working on an island because we have defined boundaries and borders. So in many ways, it becomes this natural gallery. With galleries at different scales, and allowing you to do discrete projects, large-scale projects, and this history of group show has very much been part of the island. And in 2016, it was really a kind of landmark year for the island. This is when the South Park on the island was opened up, the hills, which if you haven't been, you should run because they're beautiful, designed by West 8. And Rachel Whiteread's cabin was commissioned as part of this project that's really nestled on a hillside, and it's meant to exist in the landscape and for the landscape to grow up and around it. The park was a really transformative moment for Governor's Island. This was a park that was designed with sustainability in mind. The south part of the island was created in the early 20th century from landfill. The north part of the island, which is where the historic district is, was part of the original glacial footprint of the island. But the south part had been flat, and so this new landscape that was developed was really designed with the idea of sea level rise mitigation and these issues of rainwater runoff, and that the landscape itself is dealing with the changing elements around you. So this island itself becoming this living, breathing work. And I should note in this history of the island, in 2000, when the island first opened, the first summer there were 8,000 visitors. This last year we had 800,000 visitors. So the growth has been really immense. It's a fairly young public program, just being over a decade. But the thing that's really amazing, I find, having been a curator who was in some ways a squatter on sites to now working on the site, is what that audience looks like. There's very few places in New York City that really have the kind of web and tentacles into every neighborhood. We don't have a resident community, which in many ways has its challenges and means that there are certain projects that don't happen, but at the same time it means we're kind of everybody's turf, which is great, sitting in the middle of New York Harbor, and that's reflective in our audience numbers. So we have about 80% of our visitorship comes from the New York area, the New York metro area. 73% come from the 5 boroughs, which is a pretty striking number. The average visitor stays for about 3 hours, so the ability to linger and explore landscapes and discover things is really present there. And that continues to grow. We right now we're open a 6-month season. We anticipate that growing and continuing to extend until that we aren't a season, but we're all year. And also that the audience continues to grow and reach and get deeper into tentacles, and for the island to go back into the tentacles of elsewhere on the island. And in looking at it, one of the things that we're really working on the island now is coming out of this history, this really deep history of artist engagement on the island. We're now at a moment where the demand for projects has grown. The audience knows the island now and really comes and lingers. And how do we tell a story of this place? And how do we take the cultural program at this stage to continue to be a steward of the space and to also be a storyteller of the space, so that as people come, they're discovering something different. Nature is not one-sided, right? So as we sit here and look at the historical map, you can see the island had a much smaller footprint. And if you've been to the island, you can see in the historic map there's Castle Williams there on the edge, which at the time was waterfront property. And so what we're really focusing on now is thinking about how we as an organization, which is really not a cultural organization, but an organization that's the steward of an island, how we start to put a lens, a curatorial lens, an experiential lens on this place, and what kind of projects do we do? And what does that mean? That means when people are applying for projects on the island, that we're really looking at the relationship of those projects to the island. It means that we're getting a little more involved in production. It means we're looking at commissioning annually and in a temporary nature to tell stories. And one of the things that we did this past summer is commission an artist to look and get back to the very, very beginning of the island as a kind of project to start a new phase of commissioning on the island. And so David Brooks, who's a New York-based artist, came out to the island and he said, well, if I'm gonna look at the island, I'm gonna get down to like the pre-history. You know, there was this very dominant military history, but the island has a much longer history than that. The island was the Lenape fishing camp, the island was a Dutch farm, but the island was also a prehistoric rock. It was part of the original glacial footprint of the archipelago of New York. So David said, you know, what I'm proposing is that I actually dig into the bedrock and look at what was here before complex life. You know, kind of a grand statement, but we thought that's no one's ever told the story of the prehistoric history of the island. So David drilled with an archaeologist's oversight multiple sites in the island down to the historic bedrock, down to the original glacial schist. And the thing that was interesting, you know, for us is as we look at this program and think about how art not only tells a story, but how art starts to innovate and really in a cross-disciplinary nature that's not just a presentation of cross-disciplinarity, but is actually a cross-disciplinary nature at work. So artists working with archaeologists, artists working with scientists, artists actually shaping the future of the place. And so David installed this piece in the old battery, the old magazine of Fort J, and we worked with our friends at the National Park Service, who oversee 22 acres of the island. And this is the core sample that he drilled at these 3 sites. And one of the things that was interesting, actually, David just gave a talk at the Explorers Club a couple weeks ago about art and climate change. And he said that this was the first project where, you know, he gets asked a lot, how do scientists inform his work and how do artists inform scientists? And he said this was the first time in this project, through his drills, he discovered a layer of rock that actually hadn't been documented in the Manhattan archipelago before. So this schist intrusion that now will become part of scientific papers. So really thinking about how art and how artists engage on a level of citizenry and collaboration on the island. Because the island itself, we're building a community of scientists through the Billion Oyster Project, the Urban Farm through Grow NYC. We have a public high school, so there's so many ways now to you know, nature is not one-sided. And so I'm kind of leaving with a little tease. This summer we have a lot planned, and you know we have there's a lot for artists and their collaborators to play with on the island. And over the next year we'll be unrolling a number of new initiatives, many of which are actually dealing with the location in the middle of New York Harbor and these issues of climate change and sustainability that we on the island are really focused on, but also the architecture and the history. And so this is just a little precursor of one of the places to come.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great to have, and I learned things I didn't know, so that was always interesting. I mean, you all work in such different contexts, and I guess, you know, I was thinking, how do you each, within that, balance the various stakeholders that you work with? I mean, of course, you have your artists, but then there's also the board and New Yorkers, and then colleagues in the field that are well-versed in art. So how is that like balanced within each of your various organizations? Or can it be? Yeah, sure.
Well, it's a very interesting question, especially for the Highline, because we have an audience, we have a natural audience that come. You know, to be honest, they don't necessarily come to see the art program. They might stumble upon the art program, but I think a lot of my curatorial thinking goes into try to create and shape a program that can really talk to different audiences and different constituencies. And it's not easy because the Highland goes through 3 neighborhoods, through Meatpacking District, Chelsea, and then the south side of Hell's Kitchen. Chelsea, of course, is the art district, the most important art district in New York City. There are like about 300 galleries, non-profit spaces, museum, and so there is the art community there, which is, of course, is my first reference because that's also where I'm coming from. Then there are the locals, the New Yorkers. They use the High Line, to commute as their own, garden and park. And then there are, about 2/3 of our visitors are visitors either from the rest of the rest of the U.S. or international. And I'm talking about 7.5 million people every year. So it's kind of hard to create a program for that. And then on top of that, you have your board and your colleagues. So I kind of stopped thinking of that and trusted the artists. And in a way, I think we do a deeper work when we bring the artists for site visits and to introduce them to the site and to this side of New York, and making sure they fully understand that whatever it is that they're making, whether it's a sculpture, a performance, or a video program, needs to be able to allow for different entry points. And that can be my entry point, which is a more art historian one, and I can see certain references in the artwork, but it needs to be able to talk to everyone. And actually, for me, the most rewarding part of my job is just to sit on a bench on the Highland and look at how people relate to art. And I can tell you that people tend to walk the Highland because, of course, it's a linear path. But when they see art, they stop. And they have it's an encounter. And it can be, an enriching encounter. It can be an artistic encounter. It can be something that makes people mad and extremely angry, like the Zoe Leonard piece made people really upset and like they were shouting in the park. But just to see this, this array of reaction is probably the most rewarding part of my job, because it makes what I think art should do visible. It should provoke and should make you think and should provide a very fruitful encounter. I don't know if I answer your question.
And I guess, Kemi, I'm interested, obviously working in places like laundromats, I guess the same question in approaching people that perhaps aren't versed in thinking about public art and space, but how do you, engaging in those communities as well?
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, that I brought up this idea of what it means to be accountable and how to sustain over time, to keep showing up again and again in a place with the same people, because you're in a neighborhood, just shifts that. And in fact, it was intentional on our part to think about anchor neighborhoods, because we were adaptability and flexibility is just part of the game, no matter what. And an interesting and sometimes challenging part of working in community or working in public. But for us, that was part of wanting to recognize people over time, to watch people grow and watch them grow into a conversation about the work, whatever the work may be, because that's shifting, of course. We do different, our main commission project is about 6 months for projects. So every year we have, 5 different projects about 6 months. But for instance, on Kelly Street, where we've been for about 2.5 years, it's about really introducing a conversation, inviting people in, being visible, creating various entry points. We have this apartment. You have to go down some stairs. It's a beautiful community garden. There are many rewards if you come down those stairs, but maybe that isn't the first thing you want to do just because you have other things kind of going on in life. So we actually do free workshops after school, time to be after school, to catch kids who invite their parents. Mom, we're going to stop here and do art. We're going to do this colorful thing. And then, so again, just kind of meeting people where they are and kind of being part of their everyday flow. So we talk a lot about following the rhythms of a community, and sometimes realizing, oh, we're doing programs at 2, but people don't want to do things at 2. This community does things at 4 or 10 or whatever it may be. So really trying to figure out how to kind of follow those rhythms, but it means that we're constantly adjusting, and different times of year or different moves in the community kind of have an effect that we have to actually listen to very intentionally and kind of follow. And share information staff-wise, as well as we have a community art council and they might tell us things. We go to the community block meeting and they might tell us things, or we hear things. But I would say following the community rhythm is a really big part, and the community could be, again, a community or place, but following the board's rhythm or the staff's rhythm, all those rhythms, kind of getting them in sync is a big part of the work for us.
I don't know if you, Meredith, if you want to answer the question as well.
So for us, it's ever shifting because the island is at a kind of key moment in its past and its future, in that the island is undergoing a development process. There will be, we have long-term residents. We have the Lower Manhattan Cultural Council. We have Billion Oyster Project. We have a high school. So we have this kind of non-resident community that's ever growing, that shifts every year. And so I think for us, it's really thinking, and we're really thinking about pivoting the cultural program to be incredibly responsive to time and place, because just the nature of being at the center of New York Harbor in a shifting landscape, and in a place that's really at a moment of its intense growth, is thinking about how we create a balanced program, how we continue to honor artists' voices in the island, which has always been there, how we continue to serve the communities that come there and have been loyal for many years, and what communities aren't coming, and how does the island have a resonance with those communities, and how do we think about how the story is told. I think not getting caught into to dominant narratives, being sure that we're creating a diversity of scale and content and subject is really key as our audience continues to grow and shift.
It's interesting you brought up the Zoe Leonard to Cecilia, because I was thinking about how obviously the political landscape has kind of shaped museums, public institutions all over the country, but I think is quite specific to public art. I was, at the time of the election, personally, I was working on a big group exhibition called Commercial Break, which was putting art on different advertising platforms all over the city. And when Trump was elected, all the artists called me being like, we're changing our projects. We want to change. And I was like, okay, cool. And it's, again, to your point, that we could do that because you can be very quick and reactive. But there was also, responsibility in thinking about putting this very political message in the public realm, because it is a diverse audience that's in New York City, and it is a particular voice that we were championing, or we were sharing in the public. So I guess my question is twofold, in thinking from all of you really sort of how the political landscape has shaped or changed your artists, communities, the way in which you're working as curators, but also that kind of more responsibility in bringing those ideas into the public realm. I guess maybe we'll start with Meredith. We'll go the other way, Meredith. Too hard? We can.
No, well, I think everything's political. And so thinking about how, one of the things that I think is I've grown in this field and doing public art projects the last 2 decades, really thinking about how every project you have and how the fact that it's in public space makes it political. And even projects that don't seem overtly political have a politic to them, and they have a politic to their presentation or artist selection or the programming around it. And so I think it's really important to think about, it's a privilege to put something in somebody's public space, and we all share a public space. And so I think it's, as I get older, I think very much about being far more deliberate, coming from an earlier life of doing kind of activist projects before, and thinking about how how each public interacts. There's no such thing as a public, right? There's multiple publics and multiple people, and everybody responds to things in a different way. And so really thinking about how politic isn't, politic is not a divisive word, but as a unifying word to me.
It's a gateway.
Definitely would agree that certainly for the projects that we have supported over, since 2006 when we started public programming, they carry a politics, and that is inbuilt into the organization. So again, we're working in communities of color. We're working predominantly with artists of color. And we have a class dimension because we're really focused on communities where people are living on modest incomes. So all of that is coming into play at all times. So the project that's featured actually in the exhibition upstairs is Rudy Shepard. In our very first year, an artist who lives on the border of Harlem / Washington Heights, or did at that time, he set up a cart. He kind of designed it after a taco cart or, a vendor cart. And he made drawings. And then he invited people to make drawings with him and kind of exchange. And it was very much about connecting to people's sense of what mattered to them, what they were willing to do in public, to sit down, again, to stop, kind of interrupting the flow of their day, but hopefully enough in the rhythm that they kind of want to participate, showing up again and again, and asking Black people in that community to kind of speak to the kinds of people that matter to them. So whether it's going to be Frederick Douglass or the woman down the block or the homeless guy that actually says interesting things to them, all those kinds of narratives and images were kind of showing up and in circulation in the conversation. And then so that was 2006. You fast forward to 2017, right after the presidential election, one of the first things we wanted to do was to really acknowledge that in a different way. So our program director really brought forth the idea of using sanctuary as a theme for last year, and we're actually continuing it for this year, and really pulling up that actually was what a lot of folks in our community seem to be yearning for, needing, wanting to create in that moment. So that's how, we've had projects about immigration, et cetera, before, but it took on a different hue, and it took on we were being intentional about talking about that. And part of what came up in the discussions that were happening with our artists, so we work with about 20 artists a year in the various programs, was around what is meant for public, what is meant for intimate space, what does it mean to go underground? We're working with artists of color, we're working with LGBT folk, we're working with immigrants, we're working with folks who felt threatened by what had occurred in the election in a very real, embodied way. The threat was very, just very real, and it was for many of us, but very acutely so, and it was something that we wanted to actually talk about and figure out together as much as we could what that might look like in this moment, both to create projects, but also to work together in collaboration, and with the communities that we were embedded in.
I mean, I have little to add. I actually want to echo with what Meredith just said, that all art is political, and we can also be more intentional because we have the opportunity to work in a space that is very public. And I think it's our responsibility to also take on the challenge to be, responsive of the current climate and to be out there and create occasions for discussion and generate occasion for discussion and conversations. In a couple of weeks, for instance, we're going to open our 7th group show on the Highland, which is called Agora. And Agora in ancient Greek was the public square where not only commerce and market was carried out, but also it was the heart of the city, it was the heart of the cultural, philosophical side of the city, and we invited artists to respond to this theme and come up with works that people may say are very political, including some works by Andrea Bowers, Sable Eli Smith, William Popel. So you can be also a bit more outspoken and upfront, and I think we have the opportunity to generate that space that is still a safe space, but art, I think it's also on the shoulders of the artists to carry out that message.
definitely. Slight switching of courses, but we were talking about social media in the other space, and the kind of, I guess, it's taking on a larger role within art in general, both within walls and outside of walls. But I think particularly with public art, it's also, sometimes when you see things reposted, it also can be sometimes how you think how successful something is, for example. So I'm interested to hear your perspective on that, just kind of in thinking about how that you think it will continue in its role within the way that we place or we work in public space and with each other.
Just going to say something quickly. I don't know if it's actually necessarily just connected to public art. I feel like if you think of the kind of last social media phenomenon in the art world was Yayoi Kusama, the show at the Vidzvirk. I mean, of course, I'm pleased when I see that somebody posted one of our artworks, but I think we need to be careful that that's not a measure of success, and especially it shouldn't be the way you select or you craft your program. That shouldn't be the goal of your program.
I'm becoming a little bit of a Luddite about these kind of things, which is probably bad in our field of work, because I think social media. First of all, I think historically public art has lived on after the experience, and I think that early on, not so early on, fairly recently, when curators would think about putting on public projects, you think about documentation, you think about how that project lives on in an archive, you think about how that project, lives on in a publication. Instagram and other forms of social media are great because they get the images out, they get people to come to the projects in numbers that I think we haven't seen historically in public art. But I also, the thing that I always tread lightly with is that I worry that as these kind of Instagrammable moments become a goal for projects, some projects naturally are social media darlings, right? Yeah. Duke Riley's project, for example, with the birds was like a social media darling. But what I worry about is that means that projects that are more experiential, that are more personal, that are more conceptual and harder to define in a soundbite or a Twitter feed don't happen as often, because I think that they're just as important. And I think public space populism does not just mean large crowds or lots of hits and hashtags, but it also means people engaging in their public space and their communities in ways that have a real resonance. And I think those can both coexist well. I think with anything, social media kind of goes off the deep end at times, and and also kind of turning off of social media goes off the deep end times. And I think that we'll get to a place where there's a happy medium.
I guess I've often thought about how new technologies are going to be woven into the way that we think about art in public space. I mean, it's hard because of the rain, but I'm interested in thinking, for you all to comment if you think how that's happening, or if you have projects which will involve new technologies. And that also just will maybe fold into, I guess, my last question before we open it up to the public. But I would love to hear from all of you about your next initiatives. I know that Cecilia with the Plinth project and others, I think that would be interesting for us to hear what is next.
I'll jump in. So I'm telling all our business. I have 2 staff members here. Hopefully it's okay. So we have We have a project that again we'll be announcing in a week or so. That's taking place in Chinatown that has augmented reality as part of it, which is certainly something new for us. We have a lot of artists who have a lot of alumni of our projects who work around technology. Stephanie Dinkins, who's a really amazing artist who's looking at issues of race and AI, artificial intelligence. For instance, Salome Asega, who's also looking at issues of Afrofuturism and technology. So that's been kind of actually a real theme pre-Black Panther, but definitely riding the Wakanda wave. Really has been something that a lot of the artists we're working with it's all about really imagining what our future might look like and inserting their colored bodies into that space, which is something that has to be done with a lot of intention and force. And so we're excited. We have 5 projects coming up where, again, exploring this space of what does it mean not just to practice sanctuary, so sanctuary not being a destination. It's always, again, kind of shifting, but how do we practice it in kind of a daily way is the way we're talking about it. How does it keep showing up in the work and keep showing up in the way that we connect with each other? So we have 5 projects dealing with, one is centered around femme communities, another around queer, people of color, trans communities, Chinatown, Harlem as a place of stories, and then we're continuing to work with Ilesanmi around this We the News project. But more details later.
I have to be similarly tight-lipped since announcements come out in a couple weeks, but but for us, being on an island with limited electricity and in the middle of the harbor, looking at technology and innovation is very much something we look at, but it has to be appropriate for the site, right? And your experience there. And one of the things that's pretty amazing is that the boat ride, I always say that having to take a boat to a site does half the programmatic work for us, because it makes you tune out. You don't look at your phone, you look at the landscape. And so in some ways, what's wonderful about the island is that you get a little disconnect from being connected. But at the same time, the island is a great platform for exploring these issues of science and technology and agriculture and solar power and all of these things that we can do there that you can't do in the hive. And so we have a number of initiatives coming up where artists will be working with scientists and farmers and horticulturalists on projects to really test out new old ways of dealing with issues like climate change and like food biodiversity and sustainability issues and solar power. So we're going to be rolling out a number of those initiatives this summer. We're also going to be working with an artist who deals with technology a lot in his subject matter, but presents it in a very analog way. I'll just say that, of really thinking about how craft and, the thing about working on an island is we have, that it's tangible and tactile. And so how does art deal with these larger issues happening in the hive in a way that resonates with the materiality of that place? So we have a lot of that stuff coming up.
And I guess for me, it's harder to integrate a lot of new technologies with the Highline in a way because of what's happening around the Highline. There is such a bombastic explosion of new buildings and new structures, and screens pop up all of a sudden next to the park. So in a way, it's always been kind of part of our philosophy and mission to create this very immersive and, in the origin, like kind of slow pace of walking on the highland and absorbing the vegetation, the planting. So it's, it's, bless you, it's something that we're looking at in general to integrate more, because we also have a big lack of signage, which we understand we need to look into. But I think for the art, and maybe that taps into the second part of your question, I think we're more interested in looking at how we can recontextualize and reframe the idea of the traditional monument and the traditional public art object, which is, usually a man on a horse on a plinth, on a pedestal, in a 21st century way. So one of the projects that we will be launching next year, in conjunction of the opening of the very last section of the Highland, which is on 10th Avenue and 30th Street, is the Highland plinth, which basically is a plinth or like a pedestal onto which we are commissioning contemporary artists to create a new monument. And by monument, I don't necessarily mean something that is big in scale and scope, although some might, but is how can we rethink who are our new heroes and who are the people or the object or the thing that we want to see on a pedestal in our city right now. And so we basically did a sort of competition. We have currently 12 shortlisted artists, and the projects span from, a giant chameleon that is actually a slide for kids, to like a giant breast made of sand that people can actually change, to 150 flags all together packed. So we'll be making, we'll be choosing 2 out of these 12, and the first one we'll inaugurate next year in conjunction with the opening of the park. And the idea is to do this sort of rotating programs, but on a very kind of traditional way, and see how artists also can deal with this traditional format.
I'm excited for that. It's right by the shed as well. Great, so I guess we'll open it up to questions. We have at the front.
Sure, I'll kick it off.
Yeah.
Hopefully get the ball rolling. Okay, thank you. So talking about social media made me think about the Fearless Girl statue. And I was just wondering, one of the things I found kind of interesting about that is when the Fearless Girl statue in Bowling Green Park by the bowl. But my question is a little bit different, which is that it sounds like all you are working on temporary art. Have you had to face sometimes popular interest or whatever and so forth, people wanting to make the art permanent because they like it so much?
On the Highland, the maximum, actually it's a parks department rule, so we can keep art on view maximum for 12 months. So in a way, we love the fact that it's a rotating program, but there is also a sort of law that states that. But yes, sometimes we get complaints when we take down a piece. Actually, the first year I started, it was a project by Sarah Z, which I didn't curate, by my colleague prior did, and it was basically a bird housing complex, like a housing complex for birds, and it was very, very popular. And I can tell you that still now, like 8 years after, we get emails of people that says, "Where are the birds eating? Where are they drinking? You're killing the birds." And so they really miss that. And I think in a way, if we wish we could keep them all, but also it would be basically impossible because the park would get completely filled with art and without giving chance to other artists to. But yes, people get really attached to some of the artworks.
I can't off the top of my head think of one that kind of fits that kind of thing. I will say definitely there are a number of projects that, again, 6 months isn't necessarily the right time frame, so the projects continue and the artists continue with them, and they kind of take on a different life. So Bayate Ross Smith did a series, and one of very early on, he built sculptures out of boom boxes, and then he curates community music lists before Spotify, and those come out of the sculpture. They're of different scales. Some are like 30 feet high, kind of depending. And that's one that it's very, very popular anytime it's displayed. It was in a Harlem show at the Marcus Garvey Park a couple of years ago, and I definitely know people did not want it to come down. It wasn't at that point an LP project, but we actually did, his very first version of that project was commissioned by the LP. He's continued to do it, and it's one of those things that is kind of incredibly popular wherever it shows up, and people kind of want it to stick around.
We do have a couple of pieces that are permanent, and people are very attached to them. Can you guys hear me? Is this on? Okay. And which is quite lovely that people come back and visit again and again. Cabin, for example, changes each season. I can say that when I was in my previous life, Creative Time only did temporary works, and there were a number of pieces that when they came down or had other lives, people, felt very connected to. We didn't own the sites; they were meant to be temporary. And so, but I think that's a testament to people's ownership of works in public space. I mean, you know, and I think the responsibility of putting things in people's public space and how they engage with it and how they say goodbye to it and how that piece lives on somehow in their communities or their lives after they have a different life and a different manifestation.
Any more questions? Any brave? Oh, there's a question over here. I think there's a microphone coming to you if, okay.
Thank you. Having lived here since '76, coming from Europe, I noticed that it's of course all about New York City. New York City has been considered for the world as a capital of everything and liberty. And I noticed, listening to all that is being already done and planned, all of a sudden, maybe because of my age now, that it seems there is less of a global outlook for the project, except maybe for the future of Governor's Island, especially the scientific or global warming and all the scientific work that could be also artistic and so on. And I just, as a European born, love what I heard, but it seems that New York is taking more of a, not local, but less of a global, it seems, maybe stage, artistic outlook. And as far as Governor's Island, for example, I think it would be very nice to see a kind of beacon. You spoke of something where people could come, remember forever something not only for New York City, but for the world, especially regarding issues that concern the world. And as for the High Line, I love it. I just love it. It's just that it's very striking that everything is more local, which is normal. It's all about New York City. But in the past, there was, in '76, more, it seems, of a tinge of looking at what is happening, absorbing it, and spewing to the world what was going on in the world from New York. Thank you.
Does anyone want to tackle the question or have a comment?
I don't know if I can answer the question. I think my answer would be twofold. On one side, I think I get what you mean, and I think the way I interpret your comment is less about the nationality of the artist that we show, but it's more like the themes and the topics that the artists tackle. In a way, you know, our program is indeed very international. We show about 50% artists from outside the US, which is a lot. But it's a good point. You know, I'm trying to, you know, I think something like the piece that I showed you in the beginning, the Ella Natsui piece, I think it's a piece that talks about very specific narratives about migration and colonization. And of course, they belong to his artistic DNA, but they can very well be applied to, you know, a New York context. But they do come with a set of histories that are very present in the piece. Of course, in some artworks, that's the provenance is more visible than for other. And to your point, yes, New York is a city that sucks the energy and really, you know, he wants a central stage. So I think you're right. Some of the themes and the topics that we explore tend to be more on the local scene. But also New York is a very international scene, so.
Yeah, I think it's hard to, the artists we work with come from all over and bring perspectives from all over, and that's actually what's really exciting, kind of having that mix. But the work we're making is unapologetically intimate. Again, it's around like what is the community or micro communities that these artists actually want to pay attention to, and then there's space for other people to do other things. But for the LP, that is kind of what we're interested in, following again the rhythm of the community and what the artist is interested in, who they're interested in talking to, which for us more often than not is intimately scaled. scaled, and having space for that as well feels important, and it really varies. Sometimes if you're walking through the African American Day Parade, that's very different than having a story circle for 12 people. So it varies. Not everything is the same level of intimacy, but just that's actually something that we kind of have leaned into by following what the artists and the communities that we're collaborating with needed and wanted, and wanting to make that space.
Yeah, on the Governor's Island front, I think one of the unique opportunities we have is that being an island in the middle of New York Harbor, one of the world's most iconic harbors, how do we peel the layers of the symbolism of that, right? So we have the closest view of the Statue of Liberty. How do we discuss, this being the front door to this city for immigration historically? How do we look at issues of liberty and freedom and our relationship to this incredibly symbolic piece of public art right across from us, and Ellis Island looking at us as well? How do we, at the beginning of an archipelago, look at the fact that sea level rise has a direct impact on this place, and how do we actually use that as an advantage to think about programming that continues to thread through the rest of the city? So, I think a place that was closed to the public for so long and has such a dominant military history and was kind of unknown to New Yorkers, how do we start to peel off those layers about the role of this place? Because this is the place where D-Day was planned. This is the place. There was no active war there, but the international ramifications that this little rock had on the rest of the world are pretty immense. And so thinking about how the art program continues to pull those layers out.
And I think I just also to add, I think it's, so much has changed in New York, obviously, since the 1970s. And I think that something that all cultural institutions are uniquely aware of is that it's becoming harder to live here. For artists, it's becoming harder to work here, to have studios. A lot of people leaving, going to New Jersey, going to other parts of the country. And so I think it's kind of all of our civic responsibilities to also think about making sure that we do engage with the communities that are in New York, because it is becoming strikingly harder to live here. So I think there's also another layer that's folded into the programming. We have questions. We'll have one, maybe two more.
Where you work is probably going to be one of the biggest public-private spaces, the shed area. And I was interested in terms of what your vision is at the shed, you and Lori and the other curators for the shed, and the three people up on the stage are probably always begging for resources for their projects. And I just wondered about the use of resources as you design your public art program for the future.
Sure. I mean, it's something that we talk about every day at the shed, that we're very acutely aware of. I mean, we're on city-owned land. The city gave $75 million to the project. And so there is that responsibility that I was just, discussing. So Alex Poots is the artistic director and CEO. And, in a nutshell, I'm not going to go bore you all about talking about the shed. This is something different. But in a nutshell, the shed is a space that's dedicated to all art forms. So it has a space for theatre, for visual art, for large-scale concerts, but it's also a commissioning house. And so everything that we show at the shed will be commissioned and produced in-house, and then hopefully toured and sort of taken out of New York. And, because we have this, again, commitment to thinking about New York, we have key projects that are very sort of focused on the city that are actually live at the moment. Flex NYC, which brings Flex in Dance was a type of social justice dance into sort of 20 plus schools in all 5 boroughs. Disobey is a literary arts program that does the same. And we also, please spread the word if you know artists that are interested, but we've just launched an open call project, which is for artists across all disciplines that are either living or working in New York that can apply to the program. We're giving a sort of a commissioning fee between $7,000 and $15,000, and then working with them over the course of a year to realize the work, and then we'll show that in the shed over the course of 2019 as well. So, I think that it is in all of our thinking about the privilege that we have and the way in which we want to use that in a responsible way. So, yeah. One more question.
I have a question about the communities. everyone is talking about communities, so if you can try and maybe give us a better understanding of what are the communities that you want to engage with, probably except for the Laundromat project. It's not absolutely clear for me what are the communities that you would like to engage. Historically, public art here, I think, was spurred by the political activism and the civil rights movement, and the Public Art Fund and the Percent for Art program. So they have this idea, this human scale in their vision. And I like the metaphor about the agora, and agora is a place, of inclusion, but also exclusion. And it's a place of conflict and dialogue as well. And unlike traditional public art or monument art, which is more of historical and political representation, the temporary public art you're talking about is more about interaction. So there is this moment there. But I've seen public artwork in decay, and normally they are in underprivileged or struggling communities. Like here in East Harlem, we have this example of the Percent for Art program. I think it's called Pier 107. So I was curious to see the past of this work. So before it was transformed into a public art, it was a shelter for homeless people. They seem like they found shelter there. Then the moment this work was, this place was transformed into the public art, it scared the homeless people away. So in a way, don't get me wrong, I'm in favor of art-led revitalization of places. And like the lady there, I'm European, so I know how many cities have been revitalized through art, but also I can see this like art-driven gentrification as well. So homeless people, for example, are part of our communities. So I just maybe would like to hear feedback from your side about the communities that you are thinking of engaging. Thank you.
I think for us, it's actually something that we speak about every day when we, internally, who do we want to serve, who is our community. The Highline is 1.5 miles long, so it goes into 3 different neighborhoods, and it's probably the neighborhood that is changing the most in New York City. And, for better or worse, we've got to deal with it. And so there is an old community of residents that have been in the neighborhood for decades. And then, there is the art community that works in Chelsea. And then there are people living in the 2 large project housing complexes, again, in the Chelsea area. And then there are all the new residents of these fancy apartments, which they're still part of our community. So I think, we clearly cannot serve every single person that is there. Of course, we make sure that our standard of, operation and everything else is excellent, and so everyone can actually enjoy the park in a beautiful way. But then, especially in our public program and education and community department, we really focus on serving the people that were there before, the local residents of Chelsea especially, and we do a very wide array of programming that spans from salsa dance on the High Line, and then we also do public school programs. We go to schools, so it's not only about bringing people to the Highland, but it's also bringing the Highland to people that might not feel welcome on the Highland. So we try and experiment with different formats. It's I also have to be honest. It's hard because the Highland is also, it's a dynamic space, and so it's the neighborhood. So you need to kind of have this, ability to respond to the changes quite soon, and also the humility of knowing that you're never going to be able to serve everyone at the same time.
Well, we're kind of in an interesting, a much different scenario in that, the island, when it was deeded over by the federal government, so it had never had a residential population beyond people who are based there for the Coast Guard or the military. And when it was deeded to the people of New York, the deed stated that there could never be residential development on the island. So we don't have a resident community on the island itself. That said, we're surrounded by communities in Brooklyn, Lower Manhattan. Now that we have, our communities are extending as access to the island extends. There's no way to get to the island except for by boat. We're now on the New York City ferry, so people can get on a boat as far north as Long Island City, as far south as Bay Ridge, Brooklyn, get on and get off on the island without having to change a boat. And of course, obviously our access to subway lines. So for us, it's really thinking about how communities come to the island and how the island can act as a resource to communities that they might not have within their own geographic boundaries. We have a public high school on the island that serves all 5 boroughs, so thinking about how students get involved in our programs, how programs go back into the communities. So a project that we're in the process of working on, the island is a platform for, and the hope is that it goes back out into the communities of people who come onto the island and who engage in the project, and how do we get these issues and these projects, kind of flowing upriver. So for us, it's a little bit of an interesting scenario that we historically, and it's funny in thinking about thinking about, I think in public art, historically, there's been the idea that there are neutral spaces or that town square is neutral. We haven't had a residential community on the island, but that doesn't mean that it's a neutral space. It obviously has its own politics, and it has its own charge to it. It has its own relationships to communities around it. So really acknowledging those and looking at our role in those, I think, is key.
One of the reasons, by the way, 1,500 people go to Governor's Island every day, which we learned today. I had no idea that many people on a daily basis. So yes, the Laundromat project has defined, neighborhoods that we're anchored in. We work with artists of color and communities of color, et cetera. But we're also working all 3 of those neighborhoods, Hunts Point, Longwood, Harlem, and Bed-Stuy, the last 2 in particular, are really dealing with issues of displacement and gentrification and people of color being displaced, right? So, and issues of class that relates to that. And that's very real and very much connects to what you were saying earlier about artists, not feeling like New York City may not be the amazing global city that we understand it to be for much longer if we can't figure out how to arrest some of these changes or make some kind of change in that arena. And that's something that's very actively part of the discussion of our projects. We've had a lot of projects that looked at issues of displacement and gentrification, as well as climate change and safety and community issues, et cetera. Oftentimes, even if they are looking at something else, coming back to notions of change, movement, migration, in, out, by choice, involuntary, et cetera. So that's very much a part of the discussion going on. And one of the things that I think is very real is how for particular communities without, living on modest incomes or even completely, just off the grid economically, people of color, people on the edge in a bunch of different ways. Art actually can sound like a dirty word, and artists particularly can look like something that is about to displace them. So we're trying to work with artists who very much are part, that's why we talk about accountability. They're part of the communities that they're in a variety of ways, but they're implicated and have skin in the game about those kinds of issues, and how do we provide a space for them to connect to one another, connect to resources, connect to tools to think about this in community, about how to not let the notion of art or an artist become that dirty word that means that people will lose their homes. So that's something that is very real and that we're trying to kind of work through. It ain't easy. I don't have answers, okay? But it is an ongoing conversation in the communities that we work with, both the community of artists and then in conversation with the folks who may not identify as artists but are part of the communities that we're working with.
Well, that's, I think, a great way to end, and you can come up and ask us questions if you want to talk some more. But thank you, and thank you, Museum City of New York. Thank you.